Hi guys, and welcome back to episode number 17. Wow, we've achieved quite a lot of work in the previous episode. We have managed to create the notebook management system so we can create notebooks, delete notebooks, edit them, and that was pretty cool. We learned some pretty cool things like the change directive or ng4 directive, and in this episode we're kind of going to do the same thing but for notes. So we have to create notes, update notes, delete notes from our application, bind notes to notebooks, and some of the things that we've learned in the previous episode, we repeat them now. And like I said in the previous one, even if it kind of seems routine, repetition will really help you get your flow going. Okay, so enough talking. Let's go to work. Before we start, just remember to hit the subscribe button and stay tuned for more tutorials that will sharpen your programming skills. If you want to display the notes in this part of the page, the first thing that we need to do is actually grab them from the server. Now, the logic of the application should be the following. When the application loads, we need to basically display all the notebooks, and because the all element in here, we also need to display all the notes regardless of notebook. So that's the initial behavior. That's why we have this notebook called all, which is not deletable, it's not editable, but we have it. So application fires up, we display all notebooks and all notes. Now, when the user actually clicks on one notebook, then we should display only the notes that have been created for that particular notebook. So to begin with, we actually need to download all the notes from the server and display them in this big white empty part of the page. We don't have any logic for that. Now, if you go to the notes component, okay, we have a method for get all notebooks. We have no method for get all notes, which means we need to create it. So we're going to create a method get all notes. And again, we'll rely on our API service. And our API service does not have a definition for get all notes. So, back to the usual drill. We create an URL, all notes URL. We copy it from here. And instead of notebooks, it's going to be notes. Put the tick mark. Okay, so localhost 8082-notes, and this is how we retrieve all the notes for our application. There is one more URL that we need to put, which is get notes by notebook. Okay, and in order to find out that URL, we need to go to the API, in the HTTP file, note management, and so it's localhost 8082-notes-by ID followed by the ID. And also to get all the notes, you need to pass in notes-all. So it's a good thing we have this HTTP file because when you make mistakes, it's very easy to see how to set up your HTTP calls. And that's why I encourage you to actually create this file, test your backend, and then when you're writing the front end, just use these entries as guidance. Okay, so back to our ng app. So it's notes-all. And now I also want to define a notes by notebook URL, and I'll copy paste things from here. So it's notes by ID -- and then we'll append the ID of the notebook afterwards. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Now I'll create a method get all notes. This is going to return an observable of note. Oh, we don't even have a notebook entity. Cool. So that means we need to create it. So back in our model, we can create a new TypeScript class, Angular schematic, simple class. We'll call it note. And we'll look at the node view model for inspiration. So we open this, we look at the node view model, and we need an ID, a note title, note text, a notebook ID, and a last a date last modified on, so we know when the note was actually updated last time. Cool. Now we go here again, we have our new note class, and it won't be a class actually, it's going to be an interface because we'll not add any behavior here. So we have an ID of type string, we have a title of type string, we have a text of type string, and then we have notebook ID of type string. Pretty much everything is of type string for the note. Text, yes, and we have last modified on, okay, of type string as well. And this is our note interface. Now we have our note interface, we go back to our API service, and this method will return an array of notes, and we can write the implementation. So return this.http. If you look back here in the API, you can see that this is to get all the notes. We need to execute a GET request. So when we go back to the API, to the app, it's going to be GET. And we can use the generic version to actually pass in the expected observable, so array of note. And of course we have to pass in the all notes URL. Okay, cool. So we have implemented this, and now let's just implement the other one as well, just to get one thing straight. So get notes by notebook, and we will receive a notebook in here. So I'm going to say, actually not a notebook, we just receive the ID. So notebook ID of type string, and this is going to return an observable, and we're also going to receive a list of notes. And now we can say return this HTTP get. Okay, use the generic version, so array of notes, and now we pass in the notes by notebook URL, and we append the ID, the notebook ID here. Cool. So our API service is ready to rock and roll. Now we need to go back to our app and continue developing. In our node components, okay, we have get all notes. So we are going to use the API service get all notes, and we subscribe to this event. And now if we are successful, we have to do something, and if there is an error, you want to display it in an alert. So alert, error occurred while downloading the notes. Okay, simple message. And now if we succeed, then we actually have to store this array of notes somewhere, exactly like we did with notebooks. So we need to bring in a new property on our notes component. It's going to be notes, and it's going to be an array of notes, obviously, and we're going to initialize it as an empty array. So when we get all notes, I want to actually set this notes property, I want to set it to what I received from the response. It's pretty much similar to the get all notebooks method. Okay, and now we can bind to this property in our template, and we'll see that shortly. We'll go back to our template, and we have the notes panel, and here what we see is a list of notes. And also I want to write something in here in case we have no notes at all. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's write a message if we have no notes. So I'm going to use a paragraph, and I want to show this paragraph only if there are no notes available. So this dot notes dot length equals 0, and there are no notes to display in this notebook. Okay, so we add this message here, we open our application. Okay, and because we have absolutely no notes, we display this message, and we can see that, okay, we grab the notebooks, we don't actually grab the notes, okay, because we forgot to do something. In our component, we forgot to actually call this method. So on init, we actually need to grab all the notes. And because we didn't have any notes, well, that message just popped out. And now I've added this init statement in here. We can see that we make 2 requests. This message does not appear because we have a default note, this one, that we created using our DB seeder. So that paragraph does not display, but because you have not implemented the views for the notes, then we still have a blank screen. So let's go ahead and create some visual notes. Back into the notes component HTML, okay, we have this place where we can inject the note list. So we are going to use the ng4 binding once again, exactly like we did for the notebooks. And to speed things up, I'm going to copy paste this template in here. So a note would look something like this. A note would have a title and the main text, and the note will also have a delete button in order for us to delete it. And in the bottom of the note, I want to also display the date of the last modification. Okay, so let's arrange them like this. Let's save it, and we should see something in here. So this is how our note will look, but right now we don't have any title, we don't have any body, and we don't have the date, and also because there are no bindings. Now to display all the notes, we have to use ng4 again. So ng4 let note of notes, and now depending on the number of nodes that we download from the server, we'll have the exact number of cards displayed here. And now let's go ahead and add some bindings. For example, in this input, I want to bind the title of the note. And again, I want to make it editable. So when we edit notes, I don't want to hit any save buttons. I just want to write stuff in there like you do in Evernote or in Google Keep. And then I want that save to be performed in the background for me. So I'm going to use ngModel for two-way binding. Okay, and I'm going to bind to the title property of this note. Okay, and then I have this delete button, and I want to add something in here, a click event, and we'll call this method delete note, and we'll pass in the note. Hit Alt Enter, pass in the note, and then with Alt Enter, so the ID apparently doesn't want to help me anymore, but I'll just create this method manually in the note component. I'll go in here. Well, fair enough. I mean, the ID helped me enough so far, so we can do some things like that. Okay, no implementation right now. We'll get to it later. Okay, and the text area, I also want to bind it using ngModel to the text of the note. So again, ngModel, two-way binding. Each modification should trigger a save, and I want to bind to the text property of the note. Okay, so we'll save this, and we'll check out Firefox to see what the outcome of these modifications. And as you can see, our app is already starting to look a lot like a note application. Now we have this note, we have this delete button, we have the title, and the title is editable. We have this little text, and the text is editable. However, no actions are performed. and we need to implement create note functionality, edit note, and delete note functionality next. To implement the create note functionality, we need to have a binding on this new note button. We go in IntelliJ, we find that button, which is this one, and like we did for the notebook, we need to create a method in here. We'll call it create note. This method doesn't exist. Okay, and I'm trying to use Alt Enter, but apparently okay. So the ID, you know, has its moments. Okay, create note. And now let's implement the logic to create a new note. It's going to be very similar to create a notebook. So we'll create a dummy note, new note of type note, and let's populate this one with value. So the ID is going to be null, obviously. The title is going to be new note. The text is going to be something, write some text in here, and last modified on, you know, I don't even care, it can be a null. And last but not least, title text last modified on, let's see if we have a notebook ID. This is the most important thing. Notebook ID is going to be, well, not null actually, because when we create a note, we have to create a note in a specific notebook. So when we create a note, we actually need to pass in the notebook ID, because we want to make that link together. So we'll add in a variable here, notebook ID of type string, and we're going to link this in here. So note book ID. Okay, probably I mistyped it. Yeah, I don't know why I'm not writing it correctly, and from some reason probably because, yeah, they have the exact same name. That's why. Oh, okay, works. My ID is kind of slow right now. Okay, and I'm going to pass in, some empty string in here. Let's say something like that, or empty, and we'll come back to this later. But right now, let's just create our method. Okay, so I have a new node, and now I need to use my API to post this new node to the backend. Now, if you go to the backend, to the node controller, we have a save method here somewhere. So by ID, okay, we have the save method, and the save method expects a node view model. And we kind of need to create this binding here as well. So this is a post mapping. If we look into the NoteIt HTTP, in order to create nodes, we actually have to use post localhost 8082-nodes. So let's go ahead and modify our API service. Yeah, I have to change the app as well. API service, let's create this new link. So private save update node URL, and I'm just going to copy paste this from here. It's just nodes, and we'll use a post mapping. Okay, and now save node, and we are going to expect, we're going to have to pass in the node of type node, and we're expecting an observable of type node. And now we just return this HTTP post, and we use the URL. So save update node URL, and then we pass in the node parameter, because this is what we actually want to save. And of course, we have to use the generic version of post in order to be able to return an observable of node. Now let's see if this is okay. What exactly seems to be the problem? Okay, now it's just my ID being sluggish, that's all. Okay, cool. So now I go back to the notes component and I can actually invoke that URL. So I can say this API service save note. I'm going to pass in the note that I've just created, so new note, and then I'm going to subscribe, so my request is going to get sent. And now we are going to do something on success and something else on error. So on error, we can just print something to the screen. An error occurred while saving the note. Cool. And then on success, it's pretty much the same story as for the notebook. So we need to grab the ID from the response, because if it is a new note, we pass in null, and then after it being saved, by JPA, we're going to retrieve a valid ID. And then we have to push this new note in our array of notes. So this dot notes push, and we are going to push this new note that we have just created. Now everything looks fine here, but our application won't work because we don't pass in a valid notebook ID. And how can we retrieve a notebook ID? Well, we have to use this component, and which means when we click on a notebook, we kind of need to know which is the current notebook that we're on. So we need to introduce a new property called selected notebook, and this property is going to be of type notebook. Okay, and when we use ng on init, we cannot leave it to null, we have to actually set it. So when in this ng on init, after we get the notes and the notebooks, or better said, when we get all the notebooks, what we can say here is also that this selected notebook equals notebooks, the first notebook. So I want to select the first notebook if that notebook already exists. And in fact, no, actually this is not a good idea, because we retrieve all the notebooks and we display, not a good idea. So we'll just leave it to null, and when the user clicks on a notebook, we have to set this property. Now setting it in here is not a good idea, because initially we want to display all the notes, and the pseudo notebook labeled all is not included in this list, so it's a bad idea to initialize it from here. However, we have to initialize it when the user clicks any notebook in our list. So we also need to introduce a click event in here and call it select notebook, and we'll pass in a notebook. Now let's see if I'm lucky. Okay, create this method. So on each notebook selection, I want to modify this property like this. Okay, and in the future I also want to grab all the notes for this notebook only, but we won't be focusing on that in here. Now that we have a selected notebook, and each time we click on it, this property gets updated, what we can do is we can actually pass in, selected notebook. We can actually pass in a valid ID property, and this is awesome. And now let's go in here, let's refresh our application, and let's see if what we did actually works. So fingers crossed, we are going to create a new note, and we already have an error, and I'm pretty sure I know. Okay, yeah, exactly. So we have this error because right now when we display all the notes, we haven't selected a notebook yet, so we just display all the notes. And that means when we pass in data here, we actually don't have a notebook ID, and that's why we get the error that we get. Okay, let's try this again. So let's delete it. Let's just click on the default notebook, or on the programming notebook for that matter, and let's try to create this again. Nope, doesn't work. So we're obviously not doing something right. Well, never mind, we can use the debugger. We'll go to the node controller and we'll put a breakpoint in here. Now this is a good thing that we can actually debug these applications pretty easily. We'll go to Firefox, hit new note, and right now we should be in the debugger and take a really good look at our model. So we have no ID for a note, and we have nothing for the notebook ID. And this is where things get nasty, because if you don't have a valid notebook ID, then we cannot successfully convert this to an entity, because we cannot associate it with a notebook. And this is exactly what fails. I mean, we have to pass in a valid ID. Now, for some reason, apparently when we click in here, nothing gets triggered. So let's do something else. Let's go back to our component and let's try to log something to see that we actually are doing the right thing. So I'm going to say console.log. So this is old-fashioned debugging. I'm going to print the selected notebook, and let's see if doing this actually works, because you know it might not. So I'm selecting the default notebook, and as you can see, our click has absolutely no influence whatsoever. So let's see what we did wrong. Okay, so first of all, this is the notebook list. So okay, we've completely screwed up this one. So we want to select notebook and pass in the notebook, and when we create a new note, I don't want to pass in empty, I want to pass in selected notebook.id. And in fact, to make things even more explicit, I want to disable this button if I didn't select any notebook. And for that, we can use the disabled property. So this button should be disabled if I don't have any selected notebook. So just pass this in. So if notebook is not selected, then this button should be disabled. And okay, let's see how our application works right now. Now, at least you get the chance to see how debugging works in this type of scenario. Now, I hit default. I should go to the console window actually to see something. So I go here, I can see that I've selected the notebook. I hit here. Okay, we're changing the default notebook. Now, this button is still disabled. Okay, so there is something wrong with this binding. So let's go ahead and fix it. So it should be disabled. This should be disabled actually when the selected notebook, when we don't have any selected notebook. And I honestly don't know. Okay, so now I'm selecting a notebook. Okay, and if I add in, or maybe if I add something like this, disabled when selecting notebook is null. So now it's disabled, and okay, so this is how things should be working. So initially it was disabled, and then after I selected the notebook, it was enabled. But there is one catch here, meaning when I actually hit the all button, there should be no selected notebook. So just to implement this correctly, I have to go in here. I have to navigate to the all notebook, the notebook labeled all, and here, and I actually have to implement a click event here as well. So click, and I think we can actually pass in something like this, selected, or something even simple, selected. Let's see, notebook is null. I'm just okay, so I can pass in a function here, and let's see if this works. So disable by default, I'm hitting a notebook, it's enabled. I'm hitting all, it's disabled again. So this is a, for simple statements, you can actually implement the body of the function in here without having to explicitly declare it. Now, I don't recommend that you do this for complex functions with logic, but for these kinds of things, I think it's an overkill to actually, just implement a one-line function that does exactly the same thing. Cool. So it took us a little longer than expected, but at least now we have, a decent notebook selection algorithm. So with that said, let's actually try and create a note again. And how they say, the third time should be the lucky one. So I selected the default notebook, and I'm creating a note, and of course I have a breakpoint in here. Okay, and now look, we have a new note, which is pretty awesome. Now, of course, there is very difficult to tell in which notebook we are right now. So let's take a little time to implement, this functionality. So each time we click on the notebook, grab me the notes associated with that notebook, and let's also put in a nice message here that displays the current notebook, because as the program is now, there is really no way to tell what is the current notebook. Let's start with the easy part. Let's just add a label here notifying us what the current note actually is. We go to our application and we go to the note content. This is the notebook menu, and in here let's just add some message in a paragraph letting us know the current notebook name. I think it's name, if I'm not mistaken. And also, I don't want to display this if we have no notebook selected. So ngIf selected notebook is not null. So if we select the notebook, I want to display its name and then the number of notes that that notebook contains. Okay, so now if we reload this, now we are on the all notebook. I hit default. I can clearly see the name of the selected notebook, and at least we get a glimpse of the current selection. Let's replace this with an H3. I just want to make it a little bit more visible, because right now it just doesn't stand out. Okay, and I think we're getting better, but we still have no message for all, and I think we should. So I'm going to Control D here, and I'm going to use the exact opposite condition and all notes. So if you have a selected notebook, displays name. If you don't, just write all notes. And now the user knows that we display all notes, and as we click on a notebook, he can actually see the notes that the current selection. We still have a problem with this, because each time we click on a notebook, we should filter these notes. We should not display all the notes. We should display only the notes that have been created for that particular notebook. And let's go ahead and implement this feature as well. What we need to do is we need to modify the function, the note selection function. Now, if you remember, we have a notebook menu, and this menu, on click, we have this function called select notebook. And so the select notebook, it just does this. It assigns this value to the selected notebook. It logs the current notebook. We don't need it anymore, and now we need to grab all the notes for this notebook only. So it looks like another HTTP request. Let's go back to our API service, and we can see that we already have this implemented, and this is great because it means we can, get to work. So on the selected notebook, I'm going to use the API service and get notes by notebook, and I'm going to pass in the selected notebook ID. So notebook.id. We are going to subscribe to make that request, and we'll create the usual callbacks for success and failure. Okay, if something fails, alert, an error has occurred while downloading the notes. Cool. And if we succeed, then we actually need to repopulate that array, the array that we have, with the new nodes. So we are going to say this notes, and we are going to pass in the new selection. So we hit the button, we mark the selected notebook, and then we grab all the notes and we display them to the user. And let's see if this works. Should work. So when we grab all the notes, everything should be perfectly fine. We hit default and we can see that we have an error. Oh, let's go to network. And what's the error that we have? We have a 500 error, and we have a response. Internet, no messages available. Notes by ID. Oh, okay. I think we made a mistake. It should not be notes by ID. It should be by notebook. Okay, so we made a mistake when composing the query. If you look here in the node controller, we have this mapping by notebook. Okay, and this is what we should call to retrieve all the notes by a given notebook. What we actually ended up calling was this method, and this method returns a single note, and because you passed in the ID of the notebook, no note was found and we've got null. So the error makes perfect sense, and we need to go back in our application, in our API service, and the only thing that we need to modify is a notes by notebook URL by notebook. Okay, so it's a good chance to notice how easy it is to work with Angular services. I mean, if we would have used the HTTP client throughout all our components, then making these kinds of changes would have been more difficult. Now we are just using this request once, but you can imagine that this request could be executed by multiple components, and just this simplicity of modifying things in one place and then reusing them, it's really awesome. So another benefit of encapsulating your HTTP logic inside an Angular service. Okay, and let's refresh our application and see what happens now. So default programming, we have no notes. City notes, we have no notes. Let's create a note in here. Okay, so I'm creating the note in here. Gosh, I just forget these breakpoints. Okay, removed it, and we'll call it silly note, and some silly text. Well, of course you don't have any bindings for this, but okay, we'll see how things go. So we have default, no notes here, one note here. Cool. So we have successfully managed to create new notes. The next thing that we need to do is to actually make them editable. Editing notes should be really simple and really similar to what we did here for the notebooks. So what we're going to do is we're going to use two-way binding and the change event to trigger a note update each time the user makes a modification. Let's go ahead and do that. I'll fire up IntelliJ, go to the notes component HTML, and let's use those Angular bindings on our nodes. So I have ng model in here, and I also want to use change to trigger updates for my node. So I can say update node, and I'm going to pass in the node. And okay, so create this method. Okay, no implementation yet. So each time we modify the title, I want to trigger a node update. Also, each time you modify the text of the node, I also want to trigger, a node update event. So we are using the same binding, change, and the same function for various fields to accomplish our results, which is perfectly fine. And now let's actually put an implementation here. Now we can use some of the logic from the create node. So when we update the node, you see updated node, and let's make some tiny adjustments to this. If everything is okay, do nothing else. If something is wrong, report an error. We have an existing node, we just save it to the database. We have the modifications on the client because that's where we made them. And if that succeeds, then okay, we have a perfect save. Else, we throw in an error. Now, of course, we could do something like, use a pop-up or something to display, okay, your node has been successfully saved, but, this is just an implementation detail. And let's see if our update actually works. Now, I'm going to select this default node and call it hello2, and we should get a post here, so a successful post. Let's remove this. Let's modify the text. Hello2 text. Hit tab, and there we go. We have another post. I'll go to silly note. I'll say silly note, another post. Go back to default. Everything was persisted. Everything is working just fine. One thing that we forgot to do earlier is what happens when we click on the all nodes. Well, apparently nothing happens because we should display 3 nodes instead of 2. So we also need to implement a click event for this guy over here. Let's go back to our application. Let's go back here. And remember when I told you that we can create inline functions for simple things? Well, it turns out that clicking on the all notebook is not that simple as we first anticipated. So we actually have to put in a function here as well. So select all nodes. We create a function. It's not a field actually. I don't know why it's seen as a field. Create this method. And on this method, so I want to initialize the selected notebook to null. And I also want to grab all the nodes. So I'm going to say this get all notebooks. And now our application should behave as expected. So we have 3 nodes in here. I hit default, I hit programming, silly nodes, go back to all, and apparently, well, it's not working. It's not working. This is strange. Silly me. Well, mistakes do happen. Just call the wrong method. But like I told you, at least you get to see how developing Angular apps with Spring Boot actually feels. So it's a good thing. And now we go to all. We have all our 3 nodes. Everything is pretty awesome. Cool. The last piece of functionality that I want to implement is the delete node functionality. Implementing delete functionality should be pretty straightforward by now and somewhat repetitive. We need to go to our API service and we need to actually implement the delete node URL and method for that matter. So it's notes, and I think we have to append the note ID, but double check it, because as you saw, mistakes can be made. So if you want to delete a note, it's the delete verb, it's notes, and then we pass in the note ID. So in our case it's notes, and we'll concatenate it with the note ID. Cool. Okay, let's create the method delete note. We are going to pass in the note ID of type string, and we are going to expect an observable of any. And now we just return this dot http delete, and I'm going to pass in my URL, delete note URL, and I'm going to append the note ID. Okay, pretty simple. Now I go back to my component, and okay, this is a typo, and I think we also need to implement the delete method. I don't know if we have it. Oh, delete note. Okay, so we can say API service. No, actually we need to confirm this with the user first, just like we did for the notebook. So confirm, are you sure you want to delete this note? And if the user confirms, then we're good to go. We can remove the note. So this API service delete note, we are going to pass in the note ID, and of course subscribe to execute the request, and the all too familiar callbacks. Okay, and on success, I want to remove that note from my list of notes. So we have to grab the index of the note. So I'm gonna say this notes index of, I'm gonna pass the note, and then notes splice. I'm going to use this index, and I just want to remove one element. Okay, so just remove it from the display, and let's see the behavior that we have right now. I'll refresh the application. Okay, just close this, and let's say I want to remove the hello to text. So I'm going to go here, hit delete. Are you sure you want to delete? No. Are you sure? Okay, and now the note just disappeared. And if you go to, actually that was a delete note. I think we can try to do it with the silly notes. So delete. It's kind of working really hard now. It's kind of moving slowly. Okay, so delete. I'm deleting the silly notes. There are no notes in this notebook, so everything appears to function properly. Cool. So now we have CRUD functionality for notes as well, and our application is actually starting to, to become more alive. Before I close this, long video, there is one thing I want to let you know. If you want to preserve the changes that you do to your database, you have to go in the backend API, in resources, application properties, and you need to set the NoteIt DB recreate to false, because otherwise each time you recreate your database, each time you restart your application, the database will get recreated. And if you want to persist notes and continue from where you left off, this option is obviously, that's not the behavior that you want to have. So when you're ready for persistence, just set this property to false, and each change that you make to notebooks and notes will be persisted from application restart to application restart. Okay, that's the last thing that I wanted to mention. And that's it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. It's been 2 long videos, and we've repeated a lot of concepts. I'm sorry if we repeated some things maybe too many times, but I really believe that you learn better when things get repeated. And now that we have our applications, or a first version of our application in place, we can actually move on to the next episodes, where we'll see how to handle complex components, how to handle component communication, and we'll also implement filtering using pipes. So, see you in the next episode. Before we close, I would like to remind you to subscribe to this channel and stay tuned for more software development tutorials that will sharpen your programming skills. Just go to the Romanian Coder YouTube page and click on the subscribe button. Also, if you found this video useful, please hit the like button and share it with your friends. If you have any comments, thoughts, or ideas for new courses, just put them in the comment section at the end of this video, because I would love to get feedback from you guys. You can also find me on Twitter at Romanian Coder, and you can also check out my blog www.romaniancoder.com. Until next time, have a great day and write amazing code. Goodbye.